The dust on the wagon ruts settled slow, like the sediment of grief in a man's soul. Thomas Thorne drove the buckboard under a sky bleached white by an indifferent sun. The land around Flat Rock Settlement a study in ochre and dust. His home, or what was left of it after the fever took Sarah and the child, was a silence that pressed in on his eardrums. He needed a rifle, not for game though the larder was bare, not for protection though the territory was rough. He needed it because the finality of metal and mechanism offered a different kind of quiet, a cessation he craved more than food or sleep. The general store was a box of sun-bleached wood leaning tiredly against the prairie wind. Inside, the air was thick with the mingled smells of kerosene, dry goods, and something else, something acrid and unpleasant that snagged at the back of his throat. Mr. Silas Grubb, the proprietor, a man whose face seemed permanently set in a calculating squint, wiped down the counter with a stained rag. "Mornin', Thorne," Grubb said, his voice grating like poorly oiled hinges. "Come for supplies." Thomas nodded, his gaze sweeping the shelves, not truly seeing the sacks of flour or bolts of fabric. He saw the rifle rack near the back. "A rifle, Mr. Grubb. A good 1-inch. Grubb's eyes flickered, holding a mercenary light. "Got a few, depending on what you're payin'." He gestured vaguely towards the back of the store, past barrels of nails and coils of rope. "Come take a look." Thomas walked towards the back, the floorboards creaking beneath his worn boots. The air grew heavier, the strange smell more pronounced. And then he saw it. Tucked away in a corner, partially obscured by stacks of crates, was a large wooden cage, like one used for livestock but taller. Inside, huddled on a pile of straw, was a woman. She was young, no more than 20 perhaps. Her clothes were ragged, her hair a tangle, and her face smudged with dirt and tears. Her eyes, large and dark, fixed on him with an intensity that was raw fear, edged with a flicker of something else, desperation, maybe defiance. She shrank back against the bars as he approached, her breath coming in shallow, rapid gasps. Thomas stopped, his boots rooted to the spot. The rifles were forgotten. He looked from the woman to Grubb, who had followed him, his face impassive. "What in God's name is this, Grubb?" Grubb shrugged, a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Local problem. Got some debts need payin'. She's collateral. Till her kin show up with the silver, or I find someone else to manage the arrangement." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Thomas felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. He'd seen hardship, seen cruelty, but this was a different kind of violation. The silence in the store felt different now, charged with her fear, his own shock, and Grubb's casual inhumanity. The smell, he realized, was the unwashed scent of fear and confinement. He looked back at the woman. Her gaze hadn't left his, pleading, terrified, silently screaming. The world narrowed to this cage, this woman, and the chilling indifference of the man who held the key. His own grief, vast and suffocating moments before, suddenly felt distant, momentarily overshadowed by the stark, immediate reality of her plight. The silence stretched, taut and vibrating between the three of them. Grubb shifted, impatient. "The rifles, Thorne? You need one or not?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. His eyes were still on the woman. He saw the tremor in her hands, the way her shoulders were drawn tight, as if warding off a blow. Her dark eyes, wide and liquid in the dim light, held a story he couldn't yet read, only feel in the pit of his stomach. He had come seeking an end, a way to deepen the silence of his own life, and instead, he had stumbled into a noise, a clamor of silent suffering that demanded witness. His hand clenched unconsciously at his side. The idea of a rifle, a tool for oblivion or control, suddenly felt obscene. He turned back to Grubb, his expression unreadable. "How much?" he asked, his voice low, not about a rifle. Grubb's squint deepened, a slow, calculating smile spreading across his face. "Ah, see something interests you more than shootin' metal, does it? She's got a price, Thorne." "Everything does." He named a sum that made Thomas's breath catch. It was everything he had saved, and more, accumulated over years of bone-weary work. Enough to last him through a bitter winter, maybe two. Enough to disappear if that was his aim. He looked at the woman again. She hadn't understood the words, perhaps, but she had understood the shift in the air, the way Grubb looked at her, the way Thomas looked at her. A flicker of something sparked in her eyes, not hope, not yet, but a desperate, fragile question. Thomas felt a tug, an unwelcome current in the dead water of his soul. It wasn't pity, not exactly. More like a grim recognition of shared aloneness, of being trapped by circumstances beyond one's control. Sarah was gone. The farm was failing. His future was a blank, desolate canvas. What difference did it make how he spent his last coin? On an instrument of finality, or on a gesture that felt impossibly futile, yet undeniably necessary in that moment? He looked at the dirt floor, then back at Grubb. "I don't have it all here," he said, his voice steady. "I'll be back." Grubb chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "She ain't going nowhere, Thorne. Make sure you got the coin when you return. And no tricks," he eyed Thomas shrewdly. "This ain't something the local law much cares about." Thomas nodded, a muscle twitching in his jaw. He turned and walked out of the store, leaving the stench of confinement and the woman's silent plea behind him. The sun outside felt harsher now, the dust thicker. He climbed back onto the buckboard, the rifle rack in the store receding in his mind, replaced by the image of dark, frightened eyes in a cage. He didn't know what he was doing or why. His grief hadn't lessened, but it had shifted, making room for a different kind of weight. A burden he had not sought but now felt settle upon his shoulders with the inevitability of fate. He drove back the way he came, not towards oblivion, but towards the desolate farm where his small store of money was hidden, towards a decision that felt both insane and, for the first time in months, faintly alive. The journey back to the farm was a blur of dust and determination. Grief still sat beside him, a silent passenger, but its grip felt slightly loosened. An unfamiliar urgency propelled him. He dug up the rusted metal box buried near the root cellar, counting the worn bills by the fading light. It wasn't enough. Not quite. He spent the next few days doing what he hadn't had the heart to do since Sarah's passing, trading. A few scrawny chickens, a harness he no longer needed, some tools he could spare. Each transaction was a negotiation, a small victory against the tide of his own despair. He avoided the settlement, avoided questions. He felt a strange mixture of purpose and dread. The image of the woman in the cage was a constant, unsettling presence in his mind. Finally, with the required sum clutched in his hand, a heavy weight of silver and bills, he returned to the general store. The air inside was the same, thick and cloying. The cage was still there, in the corner. The woman was still inside, her position slightly altered, but her eyes held the same wary fear when they fell upon him. Grubb looked up as Thomas entered, his eyes narrowing. "Back, are you? Got the full amount?" Thomas laid the money on the counter. He didn't count it, simply pushed it towards Grubb. The silence stretched again, the air crackling with unspoken tensions. Grubb's eyes gleamed as he riffled through the stack of currency. A slow smile spread across his face, predatory and smug. Well, looks like you found yourself a bargain, Thorne." He didn't look at the woman. To him, she was just chattel, currency. Grubb sauntered over to the cage, a large iron key dangling from his belt. The woman flinched as he approached. He fumbled with the lock, the mechanism groaning in protest. The cage door swung open with a creak. "All right, girl," Grubb said, not unkindly, but with the casual tone one might use for a dog. "You're free to go. Your arrangement is settled." He looked at Thomas. "She's your problem now." The woman hesitated, her eyes darting from Grubb to Thomas, uncertainty warring with relief. Her limbs seemed stiff and used to movement. Slowly, tentatively, she rose to her feet, her gaze fixed on Thomas. He didn't move, didn't offer a hand. He simply stood there, a silent, imposing figure watching her. He didn't know her name, didn't know anything about her. He had spent his meager savings on a complete stranger, driven by an impulse he couldn't articulate. She took a tentative step out of the cage, then another. She didn't run. She didn't speak. She simply walked slowly towards the front of the store, her steps unsteady. Grubb watched them both, a smirk playing on his lips. As she reached the door, she paused, glancing back at Thomas. Her dark eyes held a flicker of gratitude, perhaps, or maybe just confusion. He met her gaze, his own expression unreadable. He turned to Grubb. "Need a sack of flour and some salt pork?" Grubb blinked, clearly expecting something more, some acknowledgement of the unusual transaction. But Thomas's face was blank, resolute. Grubb shrugged, grabbing the items. Thomas paid, the rest of his money gone. He picked up the sack of flour and walked towards the door. The woman was standing outside, just beyond the threshold, blinking in the bright sunlight. The wind whipped strands of hair across her face. She looked lost, vulnerable, utterly alone. He stopped beside her. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask where she would go. He simply stood there, a silent anchor in the churning dust. He had bought her freedom, but what did that mean? She was free of the cage, but not of the world that had put her there. And he was free of his savings, free of the simple, fatalistic path he had intended to take. He had acted, and in doing so had opened a door to an unknown future. He looked out at the harsh, indifferent landscape, the same landscape he had intended to leave behind in a different way. Now, it stretched before them, vast and challenging, holding not the promise of oblivion, but the stark reality of survival, together or apart. The woman looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. He saw the lingering fear, but also a flicker of something new, a cautious curiosity. It was a silent question, one he didn't know how to answer. He finally spoke, his voice rough from disuse. "My farm's a few miles west. Ain't much, but it's shelter." She didn't respond immediately, her gaze fixed on him. He saw the internal debate, the weighing of options in eyes that had seen too much hardship. He offered no promises, no comfort, only a stark reality. His farm was shelter, nothing more, nothing less. It was an offer born not of charity, but of a grim understanding that he was now connected to her fate, inextricably linked by the price he had paid and the silence they shared. She nodded slowly, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "All right?" she whispered, her voice hoarse, barely audible above the wind. That was all. No thanks, no questions, no explanations. Just a simple, understated acceptance. He didn't press for more. He walked to his buckboard, threw the flour and salt pork in the back, and climbed onto the driver's seat. He didn't look back at Grubb, who was watching them from the store doorway, his smirk replaced by a look of calculating appraisal. The woman walked towards the buckboard, her movements still stiff, uncertain. She climbed up beside him without a word, settling onto the seat. She sat straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon. He picked up the reins. The buckboard creaked as he turned it around, heading west, away from the settlement, towards the silence of his farm. But the silence was different now. It was no longer empty, waiting for an end. It was filled with her quiet presence, with the unspoken questions that hung between them, with the faint, uncertain rhythm of two heartbeats instead of one. They drove in silence. The sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the land. Thomas felt the familiar ache of grief, but it was no longer the sole occupant of his heart. It was accompanied by a strange, tentative awareness of the woman beside him, a sense of responsibility he hadn't asked for, yet couldn't ignore. He glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. She was watching the passing landscape, her expression unreadable. He still didn't know her name. It felt like a vast, uncrossed distance between them. As they reached the turnoff to his farm, the buckboard bumped over the rough track. She didn't flinch, but her hands tightened slightly in her lap. He pulled up to the small, dilapidated farmhouse. It looked even more desolate in the evening light. He climbed down and walked around to the back of the buckboard to get the supplies. She remained seated for a moment, then slowly climbed down. She stood beside the wagon, looking at the house, at the empty yard, her face passive. "It ain't much," he said again, stating the obvious. She finally looked at him, her dark eyes meeting his. "It's shelter," she repeated softly, echoing his earlier words. It wasn't just a repetition. It was an acknowledgement, a subtle shift in ownership of the phrase. He nodded, carrying the flour sack towards the house. She followed him, her steps still hesitant, like someone navigating unfamiliar and potentially dangerous terrain. Inside, the house was cold and silent, permeated with the lingering scent of sadness. He lit the lantern, its weak glow pushing back the encroaching darkness. "There's a cot in the small room," he said, gesturing towards a door. "Ain't used it since." He stopped himself. No need to dredge up the past. She nodded, her gaze sweeping the room. It was clear she was observing everything, assessing, surviving. She walked towards the small room, disappearing behind the door. He heard the faint rustle of straw as she settled onto the cot. He started a fire in the hearth, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. He put water on to boil for coffee. The small sounds of domesticity felt strange, alien in the house that had been silent for so long. She reappeared in the doorway, her silhouette framed against the faint light from the other room. She was still silent, a watchful presence. "You hungry?" he asked. She nodded. He cooked the salt pork, the sizzling sound filling the quiet house. He set out 2 plates, 2 tin cups. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the wind whistling through the gaps in the walls. He still didn't know her name, but as they sat there, 2 solitary figures in the flickering firelight, the vastness of his grief felt a little less overwhelming. He had reached for oblivion and found a tether instead. He had paid a price and received a question in return. Her presence was a disruption, a challenge, a flicker of life in the carefully constructed tomb of his sorrow. He didn't know what the morning would bring, or the day after that. But for the first time in a long time, he knew there would be a morning. And he would face it not alone. The night passed slowly. Thomas sat by the fire long after she had retreated to the small room, listening to the sounds of the old house settling, to her quiet breathing from behind the door. He thought of Sarah, of the child, the sharp edge of his loss dulled slightly by the immediate reality of another human being under his roof. When dawn broke, pale and hesitant, he was already up, tending to the fire. He heard movement in the small room, and then she appeared, looking less afraid than she had in the store, but still wary. "There's water for washing outside," he said, gesturing towards the pump. "And coffee's ready." She nodded a small acknowledgement. She went out and he heard the squeak of the pump handle. When she returned, her face was clean, her hair smoothed back as best she could. She looked younger, the fear lines around her eyes softened slightly. She sat by the fire, holding the tin cup of coffee in both hands as if seeking warmth. The silence between them was less strained than before, a hesitant truce. "My name is Thomas," he said finally, breaking the quiet. She looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. A slow, uncertain smile touched her lips, the first he had seen. "Alara," she said, her voice still soft, but stronger than the whisper in the store. "My name is Alara." Alara. The name felt right, solid. He nodded. "Grub said you paid for me," she said, her gaze direct. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact, an invitation for explanation. "You were in a cage," he replied simply. No elaborate reasons, no talk of morality or pity, just the stark truth. She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to understand the man who would spend everything on a stranger. She didn't push for more. She seemed to understand the language of unspoken things, the weight of actions over words. They began the slow, tentative dance of shared survival. He worked the meager land. She helped where she could, her movements becoming less hesitant with each passing day. They spoke little, communicating mostly through shared tasks, quiet observations, and the rhythm of their days. Alara learned about the farm, about the harsh realities of the land. Thomas learned about resilience, about the quiet strength that could bloom even in the most barren ground. He didn't ask about her past, about the debts, about her family. And she didn't ask about Sarah, about his grief. They existed in the present, two survivors forging a fragile bond in the silence. The world outside the farm remained harsh. Word reached them of troubles in the territory, rustlers, desperate men, the encroaching reach of those who sought to exploit the vulnerable. Thomas began to carry the old rifle he already owned when he worked the fields. One evening, as they sat by the fire, a rider approached the farm. The sound of hoofbeats was loud in the stillness. Thomas tensed, his hand going instinctively towards the rifle leaning against the wall. Alara's eyes widened, a flash of the old fear returning. The rider was a man from the settlement, his face grim. "Thorn," he called out. "Word is Grub's been a skin questions. About the woman. Says she was high value. Seems her kin showed up, lookin' to collect. And they ain't pleased she's gone." Thomas's jaw tightened. He looked at Alara, whose face had gone pale. The past had caught up with them. The cage may have been opened, but the wolves were still circling. He hadn't just bought her freedom, he had bought a fight. He met Alara's gaze. In her eyes, he saw not just fear, but a flicker of resolve. She had survived the cage. She would face this too. He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He picked up the rifle, testing its weight in his hands. The silence in the room was different now, charged with an impending storm. His grief, once a heavy shroud, now felt like a banked fire, ready to flare into protective action. Alara watched him, her breathing shallow. "They know she's here?" Thomas asked the rider. "Grub didn't say explicitly," the man replied, shifting nervously in his saddle. "But he pointed west. Said you paid a high price for her." Thomas nodded. The mercenary gleam in Grub's eye had been more than just about the money. It had been about control, about power. And now that power was being challenged. "Get out of here," Thomas told the rider. "And don't come back." The man didn't need telling twice. He wheeled his horse around and galloped back towards the settlement. Thomas turned back to Alara. She had risen and was standing by the table, her hand resting on its worn surface, bracing herself. "They'll come," she stated, her voice low but steady. He agreed. "What do we do?" It wasn't a question of you, but we. The we was new, a fragile shield against the coming threat. Thomas looked at the rifle, then at her. He saw the transformation that had taken place in the past weeks. The caged bird had not just been released. She had grown wings, albeit hesitant ones. And he had found a reason to pick up a rifle again, not for oblivion but for something to defend. His sorrow had not vanished, but it had been tempered by a nascent connection, a shared purpose born of necessity. "We wait," he said, his voice calm, his gaze steady. "We wait and we face them. Together." Alara met his gaze, and in her eyes, he saw not just the reflection of the firelight, but a quiet strength he hadn't seen before. The vulnerability was still there, but it was overlaid with a fierce, hard-won resilience. The past had caged them both in different ways. But here, in the silence of the desolate farm, they had found a fragile freedom, a partnership forged in shared hardship. The coming confrontation was not just about survival. It was about claiming that freedom, defending the quiet, resilient life they were building from the dust. He stood there, rifle in hand, beside the woman he had bought from a cage, and knew that his path had irrevocably changed. His grief was still a part of him, but it no longer defined him. He was Thomas Thorn, guardian of a fragile hope, standing against the world.